Here we go, folks. Kill is kiss. Kill is definitely kiss. Now sample is staple. Sweetheart
Okay,
is
too
slay.
specific, Grant.
Listen to me, folks. Everything is something else, okay? If you are saying happy, it means sad. Happy means... No, that's the opposite. It can't be that. Okay, it can't be that. Happy is handy. Happy's handy.
The film opens with a voice recording from an anonymous man reporting of a missing cat named Honey, and further speaking of a small town called Pontypool.
Mrs. French's cat is missing. The signs are posted all over town. Have you seen Honey?
The scenes cut to our film's lead protagonist, Grant, who's a radio jockey in Pontypool, Ontario. Grant has currently stopped his car amidst a snow blizzard to talk to his agent on the phone regarding work, during which he hangs up and throws his phone on the passenger's seat. He's startled by a stranger woman banging on his car window and muttering nonsensical things about blood, after which she disappears into the abyss. Up next, he reaches his workplace, where he gives his technical assistant, Laurel Ann, a thorough research assignment on 911 emergency calls. When Grant goes on air, he cracks insensitive jokes and also bullies their field reporter, Ken, in the name of banter, which ends up upsetting the show's producer, Sydney, to the point where she takes him off air before the show's finished. She lectures him on relaying news rather than saying hateful stuff, which turns into gossip in a small town like theirs and ends up ruining one's life. Grant, who's too stubborn to agree to Sydney, makes up a whole new technique, claiming that he purposefully pisses off the audience in order for them to listen to him with more focus out of hatred, and terms this as loyal audience building. After the debate not coming to a conclusion, Grant gets back on air and talks about the mysterious girl that startled him on his way to work, and asks the audience what he should have done in the situation. Subsequently, Laurel Ann receives an anonymous call and later learns about a hostage situation somewhere in their town. When she delivers the news to Sydney, she asks her to solidify the information by tapping the police radio before telling Grant, but her smirk implies that she's already told him. Grant immediately reports the unconfirmed incident by cutting off his call-in section. Sydney intervenes and tries to change the subject, which ends up encouraging Grant to candidly speak ill about the cops. In the recording booth, Sydney roars while Grant laughs to himself. She tells him that the anecdote isn't humorous, but he says they should learn to have a laugh sometimes. But the two settle on disagreement and opposing each other's views. Up next, Ken contacts them to inform them about a riot outside of Dr. Mendez's office, where the angry people are trying to break in. Before Grant can squeeze valuable information out of him, the line gets disconnected. Laurel Ann tries to confirm the news from the police station, but all lines are dead, due to which they fail to contact Ken again. Henceforth, Sydney puts a pin to this topic and makes Grant interview another family of Eastern immigrants, during which he gets a call from someone named Rick. Meanwhile, Sydney and Laurel Ann work to gather more intel on the riot from a paranoid caller who claims to be near the riot. Grant finishes the interview, while Sydney still hasn't heard from officials, though she does have 10 eyewitnesses who are willing to testify before going live with Steve, another radio jockey. Grant uses his tactics to engage the audience on the developing riot incident, which makes everyone put Steve on hold and listen to his transmission instead. Unfortunately, their transmission gets distorted, and they lose all contact with the witnesses, while simultaneously hearing nothing from Ken. Shortly after, they're flooded with calls from more witnesses, but not a single official report. They find out from the witnesses that a large number of people have died, and even a larger number of people are injured in the riot, with the purpose still remaining a mystery. At last, they get a word from a police constable named Roseland, who claims to know very little about the riots that he's cracked throughout the complaints so far. He discloses that the people were after an old patient whom they've killed, and are now chanting stuff about Hitler and Hurricane, which makes no sense. Up next, a reporter from the BBC World named Nigel contacts Grant people since they're the only ones reporting from Pontypool. Grant states that he doesn't know anything about the riot, but it's surely not political or an organized mob. Nigel asserts that the angry riot is a terrorist attack and compares it with Canada's history with separatists. However, Grant disputes this, stating that no proof has been found as of yet. Despite Grant's sincere lack of knowledge, Nigel accuses him of hiding facts. Surprisingly, Ken retrieves contact with them, who claims to be hiding in a silo after being haunted by the angry riot, and urges them to contact the police, but Sydney reveals they're unable to do so. When Grant requests more information, Ken responds that some of the individuals are nude and have started to cannibalize one another. Drenched in horror, Ken gives his live update, revealing that he has secretly watched the inhuman crowd drag additional victims out of a van to devour them. When Ken mentions a teen with missing limbs, unable to attack but mouthing something, Sydney urges Grant to halt Ken's report. Midway through the update, their call is upheld by a distorted French transmission from an anonymous source, which, according to Laurel Ann's translation, requests people to avoid family members, stop using endearments, and speak English. Additionally, there is a warning not to translate the message. Sydney then reports that she's been contacted by Roseland, who's alerting everyone to stay indoors after a quarantine has been imposed on Pontypool. Returning to the line with Ken, they play his sent voice message, which Ken claims was made by the adolescent guy who was with him. Soon comes a time when Grant struggles to believe the incoming reports and wishes to take a quick break outside, which Sydney doesn't approve of. Grant still exits the booth, which prompts the girls to play a tape for the listeners. Laurel Ann also inclines Grant to stay indoors, but he's a man of hard-to-bend will who still steps outside. Laurel Ann notices the angry people marching up to them, so she pulls Grant back in and stands in front of the door. Sydney unknowingly cuts herself when she hears the crowd repeating her words, spoken earlier on the radio. Grant calms her down by confirming her kids are far away from the town and decides to get back on the radio. Next, we see Laurel Ann tending to Sydney's hand injury. Sydney wishes to get the phone back in order to contact her kids, but during their conversation, Laurel Ann starts saying the term missing repeatedly, which seems nonsensical to Sydney. Sydney becomes concerned when she takes the kettle off the heat, but can still hear the whistling sound, which turns out to be coming from Laurel Ann, who's staring into the abyss while mimicking the sound. Sydney notices the opened window and someone breaking in, who turns out to be Dr. Mendez, the main cause of the riot. While attempting to explain himself to Sydney, he nervously watches Laurel Ann displaying odd behaviors. He takes Sydney to the recording booth and warns him about Laurel Ann. They end up locking the booth for their safety. Laurel Ann claims to be fine and tries to open the door. Dr. Mendez warns that Laurel Ann is hunting them without realizing it and urges them to limit their voices within the booth, so she loses track of them. Laurel Ann starts hurling herself at the booth window as Grant attempts to interview Mendez. Mendez warns them that things will grow worse since he's been witnessing it since the morning. Ken contacts them to update on the death of the boy who was with him. After repeating the previous chant, he begins to utter the word simple. Realizing they've lost him officially, Sydney asks to cut his call. During this, they look back at Laurel Ann, who's now biting her lower lip. Mendez grows worrisome and believes she can hear them, but Grant assures the opposite. While asking whether or not such infected people like Laurel Ann can read lips, Dr. Mendez figures out that the viral infection isn't spreading through blood, air, or the body itself. Instead, the virus only infiltrates its target when a specific trigger word is both heard and understood. And once it passes through this, it replicates itself according to the targeted person's understanding. When they debate whether or not to continue the program, Dr. Mendez responds that Grant is free to decide, but they should hope that doing so would not endanger the planet. Laurel Ann starts attempting to push herself against the window of the recording studio again, while Sydney is on the phone with her children. Within a minute of singing to her child to console her, Sydney mutters that phone lines are dead. Dr. Mendez also passes a remark on something odd occurring to Laurel Ann, which he hasn't seen in anyone else so far. Most likely, Laurel Ann pukes out a lot of blood and her vital organs on the window, and then falls. Seeing this, Mendez concludes his opinion that perhaps the infected ones die like Laurel Ann when they don't get to infect anyone. It doesn't take long for other infected zombies to break into their building, so they turn off the lights and hide behind the booth. They communicate by writing things on paper and decide to use the outdoor speakers to get rid of the infected ones outside. They play a recording of Grant saying, "Sydney Breyer is alive," in an attempt to get people to come out. Instead, Mendez starts repeating the word simple and fears that he's been turned too. He realizes that the virus is concentrated in the English language, and begins speaking in Armenian like a goofy parrot out of pure fear that he is going to succumb to it. Sydney speaks to Grant in French, which he can somewhat understand. They attempt to flee but end up running into one of the victims, who jumps on Sydney, so they kill her in self-defense. The two finally agree to one point, for once, that Mendez may be a potential threat to them, though they still refuse to kill him. The power goes out while they are discussing their next course of action, and the Canadian anthem begins to play on the radio, bringing the infected patients back inside. As they make their way to the equipment room, Mendez climbs through the glass back outside and lures the infected patients away from the building. As Grant tries to figure out how to reverse the virus, Sydney becomes infected with the word kill and starts writing feverishly on the door and walls. Her symptoms go away after Grant persuades her that the word kill now means kiss. The two also eventually share a kiss after sensing a mutual connection. Now that Sydney has been cured, the two plan to go on air in the hopes of stopping the infection, uttering a string of contradictory and confused statements to aid their affected listeners, despite warnings from authorities to remove them from the air. As an externally amplified voice counts down from 10, Sydney enters the booth with Grant, and they share a kiss 1 second before the authorities bombard their building and have them killed. Here, the film ends. Thank you for being a part of our video. If these tales of mystery and intrigue sent shivers down your spine, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more bone-chilling narratives. Stay tuned. And until next time, stay captivated.